Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story, Beneath the Broken Sky. The sky didn't just weep, it raged. Jake Mitchell had spent half his life in the air, a nomad of the jet stream, but he'd never seen a storm like this. It was a living, breathing monster, a churning vortex of black cloud and horizontal rain that clawed at his helicopter with savage intent. Below, the world had dissolved into a brown, churning sea, a landscape of flooded countryside where rooftops poked through the surface like lonely gravestones. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Rescue 1, he'd yelled into the radio minutes ago, his voice swallowed by a roar of static. "Engine failure! I'm going down!" There was no response. There was only the wind's deafening shriek and the sickening groan of the rotor blades losing their fight. He was a man who saved people, plucking them from the jaws of disaster. Now the jaws were closing on him. He scanned the deluge for a patch of solid ground, anything that wasn't submerged. A sliver of gold, a wheat field, miraculously spared on a slight rise, appeared through the grey sheet of rain. He aimed for it, his hands moving with the ingrained memory of 1,000 drills. The controls felt sluggish, a dying animal in his grip. He braced for impact. The landing was less a landing and more a controlled fall. Metal screamed as the skids hit the soft earth, digging deep, sending mud and wheat stalks flying. The helicopter tilted, a wounded beast collapsing onto its side. The main rotor blade, already fractured, snapped with a sound like a giant's bone breaking, scything through the air before embedding itself in the saturated ground. Jake's head slammed against the side window, glass spider-webbed, then shattered. The world dissolved into a concussive flash of white, then a profound, ringing silence. The storm for a moment was muted. Sarah Michaels had been watching the storm from her farmhouse window, 10-year-old Tommy a silent, anxious presence beside her. The lights had flickered and died an hour ago, plunging them into a world of candlelight and shadows. Every roll of thunder was a physical blow, vibrating through the old floorboards and up her spine. It was a familiar fear, a ghost from her childhood that the rumbling sky always resurrected. Then she saw it, a dark shape tumbling from the bruised heavens, not a bird. Something mechanical, something failing. It disappeared behind the stand of ancient oaks that bordered her property. The crash was a muffled, percussive thud that was felt as much as heard. "Stay here," she told Tommy, her voice steadier than her hands. "But what was it?" he asked, his eyes wide in the flickering gloom. "I don't know, but you're not going out there." She pulled on her rubber boots and a heavy raincoat, grabbing the largest flashlight she could find. The wind ripped the kitchen door from her hand, slamming it against the exterior wall. Rain, cold and stinging, plastered her hair to her face. She fought her way toward the oaks, mud sucking at her boots. The sight of the mangled helicopter in her wheat field was surreal. It looked like a fallen god, its metallic skin gleaming wetly in the intermittent flashes of lightning. A strange, almost sacred silence hung over the wreckage. As she drew closer, she saw the shattered cockpit, and inside a man slumped and unmoving. Tommy appeared at her elbow, his small face pale. "Mom, is he—" "I told you to stay inside," she snapped, then immediately softened, pulling him into her side. "I'm sorry." "Go back to the house, please, Tommy. It's not safe." He hesitated, then obeyed, his small figure swallowed by the storm. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She circled the wreck, her flashlight beam cutting through the rain. The pilot's door was jammed shut. She found a rock slick with rainwater, and after a moment's hesitation, she smashed the remaining glass of the side window, clearing a path. The man was wedged in his seat, a dark gash on his forehead painting his temple crimson. His flight suit was torn, his breathing shallow. She reached in, her fingers trembling as she pressed them against his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady, a thrum of life in the midst of all this chaos. We can't leave him, she thought, a whisper in her own mind. Somehow she unbuckled him. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She hooked her arms under his and pulled, dragging him through the broken window frame, away from the smell of fuel and rain. He groaned, a low, guttural sound that was the first sign of consciousness. By the time she had him halfway to the farmhouse, Tommy was there again, a small, determined soldier in the face of the storm, helping her pull. They laid him on the braided rug in front of the cold fireplace. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in a stark blue-white strobe. The unconscious pilot, the terrified boy, and the woman who had pulled a man from the sky. Jake awoke slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, dark ocean. The first thing he registered was the scent of lavender soap. The second was a gentle, rhythmic pressure on his forehead. He blinked, his vision swimming. A warm, golden light pulsed softly. Candles. A woman's face hovered above him, etched with concern, her dark hair falling in damp tendrils around her shoulders. She was cleaning the cut on his head with a soft cloth, her touch as precise and delicate as a watchmaker's. Outside, the storm still howled, the rain drumming a relentless tattoo against old window panes. The chaos outside was a perfect mirror for the roaring confusion in his chest. His voice was a dry rasp. You saved my life." She looked up from her work, her eyes, the colour of rich dark earth, meeting his. A small sad smile touched her lips. The storm did the rest. Morning arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper. Pale, watery sunlight filtered through the streaked kitchen windows, painting dusty motes of gold in the air. Jake woke to the soft, rhythmic turning of a page. He was on a sofa, a thick, hand-stitched quilt tucked around him. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but the world had settled back onto its axis. Across the room in a worn armchair sat Tommy, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read a book, his feet dangling inches from the floor. The sight of the boy's quiet innocence was a balm, a stark contrast to the adrenaline and danger that had defined Jake's life for as long as he could remember. It reminded him, with a sudden sharp pang, of everything he had lost, or rather, everything he had never allowed himself to have. The smell of coffee, rich and inviting, drew his attention to the kitchen. Sarah stood at the counter, her movements practiced and graceful as she poured hot water over fresh grounds in a ceramic dripper. She wore a simple grey sweater, her hair tied back, and in the gentle morning light, she looked less like the storm-soaked rescuer from the night before and more like a figure from a half-forgotten dream of peace. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft. "How's your head?" "Like a drum solo," he admitted, slowly sitting up. The quilt smelled of cedar and something faintly floral. Home, the word ambushed him. "Thank you for everything." "It's either that or leave you to rust in the fields," she replied, a hint of dry humour in her tone. She handed him a steaming mug. The ceramic was warm against his palms. "Tommy's father left 3 years ago. He's not used to having a man around the house, especially one who falls out of the sky." The statement was delivered simply, a fact laid bare without drama, yet the word "left" hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. It was an echo of her own fear. Tommy, sensing the shift in conversation, looked up. "Are you a real pilot?" Jake managed a smile. "Most days. Yesterday, I was more of a professional crash tester." He took a sip of coffee. It was strong. Perfect. "What are you reading?" "The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe," Tommy said, holding up the book. "Mum's making me do a report. I have math homework too, but I hate fractions." An hour later, Jake found himself at the sturdy oak kitchen table, a pencil in his hand, explaining how to find a common denominator. He discovered a surprising patience within himself, a gentle corner of his soul he rarely accessed. He saw the way Sarah watched them, a tentative curiosity in her eyes as she graded papers at the other end of the pummel. He was a stranger, a piece of wreckage from a violent world. Yet here, in this sun-dappled kitchen, he felt a sense of belonging that was both foreign and deeply seductive. Later that afternoon, Sarah led him outside. The air was clean, washed new by the storm. The floodwaters had receded slightly, leaving behind a slick of mud and debris. She showed him her garden, a patch of earth behind the house. Last year's floods had nearly wiped it out, she explained, but she had rebuilt the raised beds, fortified the soil, and replanted. Tomato vines, heavy with green fruit, climbed their stakes. Rows of lettuce and kale stood in neat, resilient lines. It was a testament to her tenacity, a living metaphor for her refusal to be washed away. "It's not much," she said, her hands brushing against a fragrant rosemary bush, "but it's mine, something to nurture." She had dirt under her fingernails, a smudge of it on her cheek. Jake found it beautiful. That evening a fire crackled in the hearth, warding off the damp chill that had settled in after the rain. Tommy was asleep upstairs. The house was quiet, wrapped in a blanket of rural silence broken only by the snap of burning logs. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Sarah asked, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Of saving people? The chaos?" Jake thought for a long moment, the firelight playing over his rugged features. "I've never known anything else," he admitted, his voice low. "My father was in the army. We moved every 2 years. I never learned how to plant things. I've never stayed anywhere long enough to watch anything grow." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and filled with a raw honesty that startled them both. It was a confession, an admission of a different kind of emptiness. Sarah's expression softened with an understanding that went beyond words. "Do you ever get tired of being left behind?" The question was a quiet echo of his own, a vulnerable offering from her own guarded heart. It wasn't an accusation, but a shared acknowledgement of their parallel scars. He, the man who always left. She, the woman who was always left. In the warm, flickering silence that followed, something shifted. The space between them, once filled with the caution of strangers, was now charged with the fragile, powerful current of recognition. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. The world outside the flooded valley ceased to exist. Power was still out, the roads impassable. For Jake, it was the longest he'd been grounded in over a decade. He fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the farmhouse. He spent his days making repairs, the rhythmic thud of his hammer against the damaged roof a steady counterpoint to the drone of Sarah teaching Tommy his lessons at the kitchen table. Their conversations flowed as easily as the creek that bordered the property, meandering from trivial topics to deeper currents of their lives. He told her about the places he'd been, the earthquake zones, the hurricane-ravaged coasts, and she spoke of the small town she'd never left, of the joys and challenges of moulding young minds. They were two halves of a whole he'd never known existed, the adventurer and the nurturer, the sky and the earth. With every shared glance, every lingering touch as they passed in a doorway, the magnetic pull between them grew stronger, an invisible tide rising in the quiet corners of the house. On the third afternoon, as Jake was securing a loose shutter, Tommy approached him, his small face serious. "Are you going to leave like my dad?" The question was a stone dropped into a still pond, its ripples expanding to touch both adults. Jake stopped hammering, his gaze finding Sarah's across the yard. He saw the familiar flinch in her eyes, the tightening of her jaw. This was the question that haunted her waking moments. I don't know, kiddo, Jake answered honestly, kneeling to be at the boy's level. My job is out there. He gestured vaguely at the wide open sky. My dad's job was out there too, Tommy said quietly, before turning and running back toward the house. The exchange left a palpable tension in the air, a storm cloud of a different kind gathering on the horizon. Later, as dusk settled, casting long shadows across the living room Sarah sought to explain, she retrieved a small silver-framed photograph from the mantelpiece and handed it to Jake. It showed a young girl with bright, hopeful eyes, standing next to a man in a pilot's uniform. The man was handsome, beaming with pride, his arm wrapped protectively around his daughter. My father, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He was a crop duster. He loved the sky more than anything. When I was 12, his plane went down in a storm not unlike the one the other night. They said it was mechanical failure. Suddenly, everything clicked into place for Jake. Her fear of the thunder, the way she'd flinched when a lone military cargo plane had passed high overhead yesterday. Her deep-seated terror wasn't just of abandonment. It was a specific, visceral fear of losing someone she loved to the very thing he considered his domain. The sky was his sanctuary and her graveyard. Sarah, he began, his voice thick with a new understanding. He set the photograph down gently. I'm not him. She looked at him, her beautiful guarded eyes shimmering with unshed tears. How can I believe that? She whispered, the question a raw, desperate plea. You live in the clouds. Your whole life is about flying into the heart of the storm. How can I not be terrified of watching you fly away one way or another? He had no answer for that. Duty was etched into his soul, a part of his identity. But in that moment, looking at her, he felt that identity cracking. He saw a future he'd never dared to imagine, one rooted in soil and sunlight, not wind and altitude. He stepped closer, closing the space between them. The air grew thick, electric. He could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, see the frantic pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. The distant rumble of another approaching storm mimicked the thunder in his own chest. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers gently cupping her cheek. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut as if in surrender. The kiss wasn't a gentle exploration. It was a collision. It was soft and desperate, hungry and full of a profound, aching tenderness. It was the frantic culmination of 3 days of unspoken longing, a release of the tension that had been coiling between them since the moment she'd pulled him from the wreckage. It was the taste of coffee and rain, of fear and hope. For Jake, it felt like landing after a lifetime in freefall. For Sarah, it felt like a terrifying, beautiful leap of faith. It was a silent promise, full of all the words they were too afraid to say, sealed in the charged quiet as the first drops of a new storm began to fall. The kiss had broken something open, a dam of restraint and fear. But as the new storm rolled in, more ferocious than the last, reality came crashing back with it. The battery-powered radio, their only link to the outside world, crackled to life with a terrifying urgency. Mandatory evacuation for all residents in the Cedar Valley. Repeat, this is a mandatory evacuation. The Northwood Dam has sustained critical damage. Structural failure is imminent. The valley is expected to flood within the next 4 hours. The robotic voice filled the small farmhouse, a harbinger of doom. Sarah's face went white. She looked out the window at the creek, already swollen and angry, its muddy water churning. This wasn't just a flood, it was an inundation. We have to go, Jake said, his pilot-in-command voice taking over. Now! Pack a bag. Essentials only. As if summoned by his words, the radio squawked again, but this time it was a familiar voice cutting through the static. Rescue 1, this is Search Command. Jake, do you copy? We have a visual on your downed aircraft. We're dispatching a boat to your coordinates for extraction. ETA 30 minutes. Do you copy? It was his team, his world calling him back. This is Mitchell, he yelled into the small handset he'd salvaged from the helicopter. I copy, Command. I have 2 civilians with me, a woman and a child. Roger that, we'll take all 3 of you. Relief washed over Jake, swift and absolute. They would be safe, but when he turned, he saw Sarah standing frozen, her arms wrapped around herself. Her expression wasn't one of relief, it was one of grim, heartbreaking resolve. I'm not going, she said, her voice trembling but firm. What, Sarah, you heard the man? The dam is failing. This house, everything, is going to be underwater. This is my home, she said, her eyes flashing with a fierce protective light. I rebuilt it from the mud once before. I will not be chased out by the water again. I won't abandon it. He couldn't understand. It wasn't bravery, it was suicide. This isn't about being chased out, it's about survival. Tommy, hearing the raised voices, ran into the room, his face etched with fear. He latched onto Jake's leg, his small body trembling. You promised you wouldn't leave, he sobbed, the words a dagger in Jake's heart. You promised! Jake was torn in two. A violent internal storm raged within him, more powerful than the one outside. The sky was calling him back. Duty, instinct, everything he had ever been, was pulling him toward that extraction boat, toward his team. But his heart, a stubborn and newly awakened anchor, was here, in this house, with this woman and this boy. For the first time, the call of the sky felt like a siren song luring him to his own destruction, while the terrifying prospect of staying felt like salvation. He looked from Tommy's tear-streaked face to Sarah's defiant one. He saw her fear, masked by a stubborn pride he was beginning to understand. She wasn't refusing to leave her house. She was refusing to be a victim again, refusing to let the storm win. He grabbed the radio handset. Command, this is Jake. Negative on the extraction. Say again, one? The voice was incredulous. The entire valley is going under. I know, Jake said, his decision solidifying with every word, but the civilians are refusing to evacuate their home. I can't force them, and I won't leave them. He paused, the weight of his next words settling on him. I'm staying. A moment of stunned silence from the radio. Jake, that's your life. This is who I am, he said, his voice raw, looking directly at Sarah. I save people. He let the handset drop. He turned to her, his eyes pleading for her to understand. But you were right. Sometimes saving them means staying. Her defiant facade crumbled, replaced by a wave of shock, terror, and a fragile dawning hope. The sound of the rescue boat's engine grew louder in the distance, then faded as it turned and disappeared down the valley. The sound of their last chance leaving. The creek had already breached its banks, its dark water creeping across the lawn. The river beyond was a torrent. We have to get to higher ground, Jake commanded, his voice clear and steady. The choice was made. The sky had been denied. We'll take what we can to the barn, and the hayloft is our only shot. He grabbed the silver-framed photograph of her father from the mantelpiece, pressing it into her hands. It was a silent acknowledgement. He understood. As the first wave of floodwater lapped at the porch steps, they worked together. A small, desperate family against the rising storm, carrying their most precious belongings. Not furniture, but memories and a newfound, terrifying love, toward the only sanctuary they had left. Dawn broke not with a triumphant fanfare, but with a quiet, sacred hush. The sky, scrubbed clean by the storm, was a delicate watercolour of rose and gold. From the high hayloft of the barn, Jake, Sarah and Tommy watched the sun crest the bruised horizon, its light glinting off a vast, silent sea. The valley was gone, submerged beneath a placid brown lake. Only the tops of the tallest trees and the roofs of a few buildings on the highest ground remained, islands in a drowned world. Their farmhouse was submerged to the eaves, a wounded survivor. But they had made it. Huddled together under horse blankets, listening to the water lap against the barn walls all night, they had survived. That sunrise marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. 6 months later, the water was a memory, leaving behind a landscape of mud, renewal, and relentless work. The valley was healing, and so were they. Jake never left. The crash that had brought him here had also grounded him in a way he'd never thought possible. With his savings and a small business loan, he had started a local emergency response centre, a small-scale operation with 2 all-terrain vehicles and a rugged inflatable boat. He was still saving people, but now they were his neighbours. He saved them from flash floods, from farm accidents, from the small disasters of rural life. He'd found a way to answer the call of duty without leaving the woman he loved. He hadn't chosen earth over sky, he had learned to hold them both. Sarah's garden was thriving again. The soil enriched by the flood's silt was dark and fertile. Her neat rows of vegetables were a testament to her enduring spirit. But now something new was woven among the sunflowers and tomato cages. Hanging from the sturdy stalks were Jake's old pilot medals glinting in the sun. He'd given them to her one afternoon, a quiet offering of his past. She had placed them here among the growing things, intertwining the man he was with the man he was becoming. Tommy had changed too. The quiet, anxious boy had blossomed. The fear in his eyes had been replaced by a bright, confident spark. He spent his afternoons at the response centre, which Jake ran out of the repaired barn, learning how to check the oil in the ATV and coil ropes with a perfect knot. He wasn't afraid of the emergency radio anymore. He saw it as a tool for helping, a connection to the father figure who hadn't left. He was learning about engines and preparedness, about courage and partnership. One warm evening, as the sun began to dip below the rebuilt fence line, Jake found Sarah in the garden, her hands buried in the rich soil. He didn't have a diamond ring. He had spent his life accumulating experiences, not possessions. Instead, he held out his hand. In his palm lay a set of keys. One was old and brassy, the key to the farmhouse. The other was new and shiny, the key to his truck. The last was a small silver key to the front door of the response centre. "I used to think home was wherever I landed," he said, his voice steady and full of a quiet, profound certainty. He looked from the keys in his hand to her face, illuminated by the golden light. A temporary base, a place to sleep before the next mission. Sarah slowly stood up, wiping her earthy hands on her jeans. Her heart felt impossibly full, a vessel brimming with a love she had once believed was lost to her forever. He curled his fingers around the keys and held them out to her. "Now I know it's not," he continued, his gaze locking with hers. "Home isn't a place you land. It's the place you choose to stay. The place you build and rebuild and fight for." He took a breath. "Will you build a home with me, Sarah?" Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so deep it was almost painful. She didn't need a ring, she didn't need a flowery promise, she needed this. The solid, tangible weight of permanence, keys that jangled like wind chimes, promising shared doors and a shared future. She closed her hand over his, over the keys, her touch warm and sure. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, always. Those storms tear everything apart. They leave behind nothing but wreckage and sorrow. But others, the ones you weather together, the ones that strip you down to the very core of who you are, they don't destroy. They reveal what was strong enough to last all along. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to open your door to a stranger falling from a broken sky, you discover that home was never a place at all. It was a choice, it was a promise. It was the safe harbour you find in someone else's heart." Almost home. The rain had been drumming against the kitchen window for 3 weeks, a relentless weeping percussion that had become the soundtrack to Lena's grief. It was a sound that mirrored the hollowness inside her, a space carved out by the sudden, brutal absence of her brother Mark. On the cramped Formica countertop, 2 letters sat like twin sentences of doom. One was a pale pink eviction notice, its cheerful colour a cruel joke. The other was a crisp, official-looking envelope from US Immigration and Customs Enforcement addressed to Aidan Hayes. Deportation. The word itself was a punch to the gut, another loss she couldn't bear. The ticking of the clock above the stove felt unnaturally loud, each second a tiny hammer against the fragile shell of her composure. 3 weeks since the funeral. 3 weeks of waking up to the reality that Mark was gone, and now Aidan, his best friend, the only other person who seemed to understand the specific shape of her sorrow, was about to be ripped away too. Aidan sat across from her at the tiny wobbly table, his large frame making the space feel even smaller. He hadn't said much, just showed up with a bag of groceries he knew she'd forget to buy, and a silence that was more comforting than any platitude. He stared at his letter, his jaw tight, his usual easygoing energy replaced by a heavy stillness. The steam from a forgotten tea kettle began to whistle, a thin, frantic scream that Lena couldn't bring herself to answer. "I have an idea," she said, her voice a raw whisper that barely carried over the rain in the kettle. She pushed a crumpled tissue across the table, adding it to the damp pile. "It's either brilliant or completely insane." Aidan finally looked up. His eyes, the colour of moss after a storm, were clouded with exhaustion. "I'm open to insane right about now." Lena took a shaky breath, her heart thudding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She slid his deportation letter and her eviction notice together, placing them side by side. "You need to stay in the country. You have a job waiting for you at the bakery, the one Mark was so excited for you to take. And I need to not be homeless." She looked from the papers to his face, her gaze unwavering. "So, we get married." Silence descended, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the ticking clock and the rain. For a moment, Aidan just stared at her. Then a short, sharp laugh escaped him, a sound utterly devoid of humour. It died the instant he saw the desperate seriousness in her eyes. The tears she'd been holding back finally welled, blurring his stunned face. "Lena, you can't be serious," he said, his voice soft, laced with disbelief. "Why not?" she pushed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It's a business arrangement. A partnership. You get a green card, I get a roommate who can help me with rent, help me get the bakery open. It was our dream, mine and Mark's. You were supposed to be a part of it." She gestured vaguely around the cramped apartment. "This isn't about love or romance or any of that. It's about survival." "Your brother would kill me," Aidan murmured, shaking his head slowly. "He would haunt me from the great beyond if he knew I was even considering this. You're his little sister." The mention of Mark was a physical blow, and Lena flinched. "My brother's not here to stop us," she said, the words tasting like ash. "He's not here, and if we don't do something, everything he and I worked for, everything he wanted for you is going to disappear. The bakery, he called it almost home, because it was supposed to be the place we all finally landed." Her voice broke on the last word. She reached for the letters, her hand trembling. Aidan's hand shot out to steady hers, his fingers warm and calloused, engulfing her own. The touch was accidental, a simple gesture of comfort, but it sent a strange, unexpected current through her. It was a flicker of warmth in the cold, desolate landscape of her grief. For a split second, the rain seemed to quiet. The ticking clock seemed to fade, and there was only the feeling of his hand on hers, a silent acknowledgement of the precipice on which they stood. This wasn't about love, she told herself again. But as his thumb brushed gently over her knuckles, a tiny, treacherous part of her heart wondered if that was a lie they were telling themselves to make the insanity of it all bearable. The lawyer's office was a universe of beige carpets and sterile fluorescent lighting that hummed with an unnerving buzz. It stripped the world of colour, making the vibrant autumn warmth just outside the window feel like a distant memory. Lena sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, listening as the lawyer, a woman with a weary but kind face, laid out the stakes. "The burden of proof is on you," she explained, her pen tapping a rhythm on a thick file. "You have to prove the legitimacy of your marital union. They'll ask about your history, your habits, how you met, your daily routines. They are trained to spot fraud." Lena and Aidan exchanged a nervous glance. They'd spent 2 nights cramming, whispering fabricated memories and personal details to each other like students before a final exam. His favourite colour is slate blue. She hums off-key when she's concentrating. He hates cilantro. She sleeps on the left side of the bed. It felt cheap, a flimsy stage play built on the foundation of their shared grief for Mark. The courthouse was even more impersonal. They were a number in a queue waiting for their turn in a small windowless room. When the justice of the peace, a man who looked as tired as the lawyer, began to recite the vows, the world seemed to slow down. The rote standard-issue words suddenly felt heavy with meaning. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer. Lena's throat tightened. Worse had already come. Poorer was staring her in the face. In sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part. When it was Aidan's turn to repeat the lines, his voice, usually so steady, caught on the words, "in sickness and in health." It was a tiny, almost imperceptible break, but Lena heard it. In that moment, he wasn't just an actor reciting lines. He was a man who had sat by Mark's hospital bed, a man who had seen sickness and its devastating aftermath. Her eyes stung with unshed tears. "You may kiss the bride," the justice said, his tone flat. An awkward, charged silence hung between them. This was the part they hadn't reversed. Aidan's gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before meeting her eyes again. He saw the panic there, the uncertainty. Instead of a kiss, he leaned in and gently pressed his forehead against hers. It was a gesture of such profound, unexpected tenderness that it stole her breath. As he pulled back, their new wedding rings, simple cheap silver bands they'd bought at a pawn shop, clinked together. The sound was small but definitive. "We're really doing this," she whispered, the reality of it finally landing. Aidan offered a small crooked smile. "Too late for second thoughts now, Mrs. Fletcher." The name felt foreign, a costume she was wearing. Later that afternoon they stood in the doorway of the bakery. It was the first time they had entered the space not as Mark's sister and Mark's best friend, but as partners. His partners. The air hung thick with the comforting scent of old flour vanilla extract and the faint, sweet ghost of yeast. Dust motes danced in the shafts of autumn light that slanted through the large, grimy front windows. "He found this place," Lena said softly, running a hand along a flour-dusted countertop. "Said it had good bones." "It does," Aidan agreed, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous quiet. As she turned to survey the cavernous space, her foot caught on a loose floorboard. She yelped, stumbling forward. Instantly, Aidan was there, his hand shooting out to grip her waist, steadying her against his chest. She landed flush against him, her palms flat on the solid wall of his torso. For a long moment, they both froze. His heart hammered a steady, reassuring beat against her cheek. She could feel the warmth of his body through their clothes, smell the faint, clean scent of his soap mixed with the dusty air of the bakery. It was different from the touch in the kitchen, different from the forehead press at the courthouse. This was solid, real. It was the first undeniable hint of genuine attraction, a spark of heat that had nothing to do with shared grief or legal arrangements, and everything to do with the man holding her in the fading afternoon light. The bakery became their world, a sanctuary sealed by the pre-dawn dark and the scent of rising dough. Their lives fell into a rhythm dictated by the demanding schedule of a baker. Alarms blared at 4 a.m. And they would meet in the shared kitchen of Lena's, now their apartment, moving around each other in a sleepy silent ballet. They were a study in contrasts. Lena worked with the meticulous precision of a scientist, her measuring cups levelled with a knife's edge, her recipes followed to the gram. She was the architect of their operation. Aidan, however, was the artist. He cooked by feel, by scent, by intuition. He'd add a pinch of cardamom to Mark's cinnamon roll recipe, or a dash of espresso powder to the chocolate croissants, his movements fluid and confident. Baking is chemistry, Lena would insist, her brow furrowed in concentration. Baking is magic, Aidan would counter, a playful glint in his eye, as he slid another perfectly golden tray from the oven. Their days were filled with the physical language of shared work. Flour found its way onto everything, a white handprint on the small of her back as he squeezed past in the narrow walkway, a dusting on his cheek that she would gently brush away without thinking. One afternoon he stood behind her, his larger hands covering hers as he taught her to properly knead brioche dough. "You have to feel it," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "Push, fold. It's a rhythm, like a heartbeat." His chest was warm against her back, and Lena found herself closing her eyes, focusing not on the dough but on the steady cadence of his breathing, the strength in his hands guiding hers. The nights were for confessions. Exhausted and covered in flour, they would sit at a small table in the back, sharing failed sourdough starters and burnt cookies, the failures somehow more intimate than the successes. It was in these late hours, with rain drumming softly on the bakery's skylights, that they started sharing pieces of themselves. He told her about his childhood in Dublin, a place he spoke of with a mixture of love and restlessness. She told him about her recurring nightmare, the one where she was falling and Mark was always just out of reach. "He always said you made the best chocolate croissants," Lena found herself saying one night, her voice thick with emotion as she looked at the tray cooling on the rack. Aidan smiled, a sad, fond expression. "He always said you were stronger than you knew." But their fragile peace was bound to break. It happened over a small metal recipe box, Mark's box. Lena had been searching for his specific instructions for an Irish soda bread, a recipe he only made on her birthday. She found Aidan sitting with the box open, sifting through the familiar ink-stained cards. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Just looking," he said quietly. "Those are mine," she snapped, an ugly, possessive grief rising in her throat. They were his. They belonged to me. Aidan's head shot up, his expression wounded. "I was his friend for 15 years, Lena. I was there when he wrote half of these. Do you think you're the only one who misses him? Is your grief bigger than mine? Is your right to his memory stronger?" The words hit her like a physical slap. The fight was short, brutal, and filled with the unspeakable things that only two people drowning in sorrow could say to each other. She fled, the sting of his words chasing her until she found refuge in the biting cold of the walk-in cooler. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees as sobs finally racked her body. She cried for Mark, for the fight, for the terrifying, complicated mess her life had become. A few minutes later, the heavy door opened, spilling light into the small, cold space. Aidan stood in the doorway, his face etched with regret. He didn't speak. He simply took off the worn, comfortable jacket he always wore, the one that smelled faintly of yeast and cinnamon, and draped it over her shaking shoulders. He closed the door, leaving her in the cold and the dark, but wrapped in his warmth. It was an apology, a comfort, a silent truce, and in that quiet, profound gesture, Lena understood that their rhythm wasn't just about baking. It was about learning how to shelter each other from the storm. The immigration office felt like a different planet from the warm, fragrant world of the bakery. The air was stale, the lighting a harsh, unforgiving glare. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Across the small metal table, the immigration agent, a stern-faced man named Mr. Davies, regarded them with an unnervingly calm neutrality. His questions were like surgical instruments probing for weaknesses in their story. "Mr. Hayes, what brand of toothpaste does your wife use?" "Crest, the one with baking soda and peroxide," Aidan answered, without hesitation. He'd noticed it on their shared bathroom counter weeks ago. "Mrs. Fletcher Hayes, what side of the bed does your husband sleep on?" "The right side," Lena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He always takes the side closest to the door." They moved through the rehearsed answers, a careful choreography of half-truths and well-placed details. But Mr. Davies was good at his job. He circled, he changed tactics. He asked about feelings, not facts. "Tell me about your first date." A wave of panic washed over Lena. They'd concocted a story about a movie and Italian food, but under the agent's intense scrutiny it felt flimsy, transparent. Aidan must have sensed her fear. He stepped in smoothly. "Our first real date wasn't really a date," he said, his voice taking on a warm, reminiscent tone. "It was the night we perfected her brother's sourdough. We were in the bakery until 3 a.m. She gets this little frown of concentration right between her eyebrows when she's trying to get something perfect, and she hums this little off-key tune. She doesn't even know she's doing it." He looked at Lena, a genuine, fond smile touching his lips. "That was our first date, covered in flour, exhausted, and happier than I'd been in a very long time." It was a detail they had never rehearsed. It was a detail only a real husband would know, an observation born from hours spent watching her, learning her. Mr. Davies made a note, his expression unreadable, but the sharp edge of his questioning seemed to soften. Back in the apartment, the adrenaline crash was swift and brutal. The tension that had held them upright for hours evaporated, leaving them exhausted and raw. Aidan poured them both a glass of whiskey, his hands not quite steady. They sat on the sofa, the space between them humming with everything that had been left unsaid. "When did this stop being pretend for you?" Lena asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the lamplit room, terrifying and essential. Aidan stared into his glass, swirling the amber liquid. "Maybe it never was pretend," he admitted, his gaze finally meeting hers. His eyes were dark with a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "Maybe that's what scares me. I have loved you for years, Lena, from afar. You were Mark's sister, and he was my best friend. It was a line I would never cross." He let out a shaky breath. "But he's gone, and this whole arrangement, it's been torture. Pretending this is just for show and all I want to do is this." He leaned in, his movement hesitant, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. His confession unlocked something deep inside her, a truth she hadn't dared to acknowledge. She wasn't just grieving Mark anymore. She was terrified of loving someone else, terrified of the gaping hole they would leave if they were taken away too. "I've been so afraid," she breathed, the admission tearing from her. So afraid to let anyone matter this much again. The space between them vanished. Aidan's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin with a reverence that made her ache. "You don't have to be afraid with me," he murmured, and then he kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste press of foreheads at the courthouse. This was a kiss of searing honesty, a confluence of years of unspoken longing and weeks of forced intimacy. It was desperate and sweet, a raw outpouring of grief and hope and a terrifying, beautiful new love. It was the breaking point, the moment the carefully constructed walls of their arrangement came crashing down, leaving them standing in the vulnerable, uncertain, and breathtaking ruins of the truth. 6 months later, the bakery was alive. Golden hour light streamed through the now spotless front windows, illuminating the happy chaos within. The air, rich with the scent of caramelized sugar, toasted almonds, and fresh bread, was filled with the sounds of laughter and satisfied sighs. Almost Home was finally open, and the community had poured in, filling every chair and lining up out the door. Lena stood behind the counter, a clean apron tied around her waist, and watched Aidan. He moved through the crowd with an easy grace, handing a warm pain au chocolat to a little girl, sharing a laugh with an elderly couple, his face lit with a genuine joy that made her heart swell. He wasn't the haunted man who had sat at her kitchen table staring at a deportation letter. He was vibrant, he was happy, he belonged. And watching him, Lena realised with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity how far they had both come. She was no longer just a woman defined by her grief. She was a baker, a business owner, a wife. Just as she was handing a seeded loaf to a customer, the bell above the door chimed, and her blood ran cold. It was Mr. Davies, the immigration agent, holding a coffee cup and looking around with that same neutral expression. A surprise follow-up. Her carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. He approached the counter, his eyes moving from the bustling scene to the two of them. Aidan came to stand beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring weight. She could feel the unspoken question in the air. Was this real enough? Was it enough to defend? Busy day, Mr. Davies observed, his gaze lingering on a framed photo of Mark, Lena, and Aidan, taken a year before the accident, that now sat on the counter. "We've been lucky," Aidan said, his hand finding Lena's under the counter, his fingers lacing through hers. "This is more than luck," Lena heard herself say, her voice clear and strong. She looked from the agent to Aidan, whose eyes were filled with a fierce, protective love. In that instant, she knew the charade was over, not because they were caught, but because it was no longer needed. This isn't about papers anymore. Aidan's grip on her hand tightened. "It never was. Not really," he said, his gaze locked with hers. Lena turned her focus back to Mr. Davies, but her words were for everyone in the room, for herself, for the memory of her brother. "This man," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "is my partner. He's my best friend. He's the reason I got out of bed for months when I didn't think I could. He helped me build this place from the dust up. This bakery, this life, wouldn't exist without him." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and cleansing. "I love him, not for a green card, not for an arrangement. I love him because he showed me what home feels like again." A hush fell over the bakery, and then, in front of the entire community, she rose on her toes and kissed him, a public declaration that sealed the truth of her words. 1 year later, they stood in that same spot, the bakery closed for a private celebration. The golden light was the same, the scent of yeast and sugar still hung in the air, but this time they were surrounded by the friends who had become their family, renewing their vows. The cheap silver bands were gone, replaced by rings of white gold they had chosen together. Rings that symbolized a promise made not out of desperation, but out of a deep and abiding love. The justice of the peace, the same tired man from the courthouse now smiling warmly, pronounced them husband and wife again. This time, when Aidan kissed her, it was soft and sure, a promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. Later, long after the last guest had departed, they stood side by side at the large kneading table. Lena reached for a bag of flour, leaving a white handprint on Aidan's apron. He smiled, covering her hand with his own. Their fingers, intertwined and dusted with flour, rested on the worn wood of the table. They weren't almost home anymore. They had built it, one careful layer at a time, right here, together. Racing hearts. The silence that followed a race was a sound all its own. It was a hollow ringing in Luca Rivera's ears, the ghost of 1,000 screaming RPMs. In the concrete tomb of the underground parking garage, the only other sound was the metallic ping-ping-ping of his said Mustang's cooling engine, a sound like a slowly calming heart. His heart. He leaned against the pony's flank, the metal still warm through his leather jacket, and dragged a hand through his sweat-damp hair. He'd won. He always won. But the victory felt as empty as the echoing cavern around him. This was his escape, the one place he could outrun the ghosts that haunted his family name. Then a new sound, the soft scuff of a shoe against grit. He straightened instantly, every muscle coiling. Cops didn't scuff. Rival crews didn't linger into the shadows. They announced themselves with revving engines and blinding headlights. This was different, quiet, measured. A figure detached itself from the gloom behind a thick concrete pillar. A woman. She held a phone up, the lens aimed not at him, but at the rear of his car, at his license plate. In 3 long strides he closed the distance, his hand clamping gently but firmly around her wrist. The phone clattered to the ground. Her gasp was a sharp, stolen breath in the heavy air. "You're either very brave or very stupid," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the concrete. He looked down at her, the wide, startled eyes that reflected the flickering fluorescent light above. She wasn't dressed like a cop or a gearhead. She wore a tailored blazer and dark jeans, a stark contrast to the grit and grime of his world. Her chin lifted, a flicker of defiance chasing the fear from her eyes. "Maybe both," she shot back, her voice steadier than he expected. "Just like you." He let a slow smile touch his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. He released her wrist, watching as she rubbed the spot, never breaking his gaze. He bent and retrieved her phone, holding it between 2 fingers like a piece of evidence. Photographing license plates in a place like this, that's a good way to get yourself hurt. "I'm a law student," she said, the words precise, as if she were building a case. "I'm researching illegal street racing for a white paper on prosecutorial strategy." He almost laughed. "A law student. You couldn't find a book?" "Books don't have the smell of burnt rubber and motor oil," she countered, her gaze sweeping the garage. "They don't capture the echo of footsteps in a place that feels like it's holding its breath. I needed to understand the environment." Her words struck a chord. She saw the poetry in the grime, the tension in the silence. He handed the phone back to her, their fingers brushing. A spark, low and electric, arced between them. He felt it. He saw in the slight parting of her lips that she did too. It was an unwelcome jolt, a current he had no business feeling, especially not with a woman who represented everything he was running from. Rules, order, the law. "Eva Santos," she said, extending a hand as if they were meeting at a cocktail party instead of a clandestine crime scene. He hesitated before taking it. Her hand was cool, her grip surprisingly firm. "Luca Rivera." The name hung in the air between them. He saw the shift in her eyes, a flicker of recognition that went beyond his reputation in the racing scene. It was a deeper, older acknowledgement. A shadow. Santos, Rivera. The names were relics of a past their parents had written, a history of tangled alliances and bitter betrayals in the city's criminal underworld. His father had gone legit, turning his mechanical skills into a thriving garage business. Her family, he knew, had not been so successful in their escape. "Rivera," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The magnetic pull that had crackled between them was now charged with something heavier. Danger. History. "You know the name," he stated, not a question. "My father knew your father," she said carefully, withdrawing her hand. The warmth was gone. A long time ago, the unspoken words filled the space between them. Before my family fell apart, before yours scrubbed itself clean. Eva's carefully constructed world of legal statutes and scholarly articles had just collided with the raw, visceral reality she was only supposed to be observing. She had come here for research, to understand the mindset of men like Luca Rivera. But she hadn't expected to find a piece of her own broken history waiting for her in the shadows. He watched her, this woman who was a walking contradiction, a law student drawn to the lawless, a Santos who flinched at the name Rivera. She was looking at him with an unnerving mix of academic curiosity and something far more personal, something that felt dangerously like understanding. And in that moment, under the hum of a dying fluorescent bulb, Luca felt a different kind of risk, one that had nothing to do with hairpin turns and everything to do with the collision course he was on with Eva Santos. The attraction was mutual, undeniable, and it screamed a warning that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure he wanted to heed. Eva's safe space smelled of old paper, brewing coffee, and rain. The Law Library Cafe was her sanctuary, a fortress of logic and precedent where the chaotic ghosts of her family's past couldn't reach her. Ordinarily, the steady scratch of her pen on a legal pad was a comforting rhythm, the soundtrack to her ambition. But today the rhythm was off. Her mind wasn't on contracts and torts. It was in a concrete garage, filled with the scent of motor oil and the low rumble of a man's voice. Luca Rivera. She stared at her laptop, the screen illuminating a dozen articles, forum posts and grainy race videos. He was a phantom, a legend in the city's underbelly. His driving was described as fearless, poetic, reckless. But as she dug deeper, a different picture emerged. Rivera & Sons Automotive, a legitimate, respected business. Customer testimonials praised Luca's almost supernatural diagnostic skills. He wasn't just a thug in a fast car, he was a master mechanic, an artist with a wrench and a wiring diagram. He was a man of two worlds, just as she was. He ran a legal business by day and broke the law by night. She studied the law by day, while the shadow of her family's lawlessness clung to her. A notification popped up on a social media page she was scrolling through. A friend of a friend had posted a photo from a car show months ago. In the background, leaning against a polished engine block, was Luca. He was laughing, head thrown back, a genuine, unguarded expression that made her breath catch. It was a world away from the wary, intense man in the garage. The bell above the cafe door chimed, pulling her from her digital rabbit hole, and then the scent of motor oil and rain-damp leather filled the air, so potent it felt like a memory come to life. Luca Rivera stood there, shaking the water from his jacket, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. For a moment, the entire cafe seemed to fade into the background. He moved with a quiet confidence that was utterly out of place among the hunched-over students and steaming mugs. He approached her table, pulling up a chair without asking. "Fancy meeting you here," he said, his lips curling into that same wry, unsettling smile. Eva closed her laptop slowly. "Stalking me, Rivera?" "Let's call it a follow-up inquiry," he countered, his gaze dropping to her scattered books. "I find myself in need of some legal advice, on a hypothetical matter, of course." The game was set. She leaned back, crossing her arms, playing her part. "My consultation fees are steep." "I'm sure they are." He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, closing the space between them. The air grew thick with a tension that was part interrogation, part flirtation. Hypothetically, if a person were to be present at an event where certain traffic violations occurred, what would their exposure be? "Hypothetically," Eva began, her voice cool and professional, It would depend on their level of involvement. Were they a spectator, an organiser, a participant? What if they were just there, he asked, his dark eyes holding hers, searching for something beyond the legal jargon. Watching a woman take pictures of their license plate. Her carefully constructed walls, the ones built from case law and precedent, began to show cracks. This wasn't a game of cat and mouse. This was a man trying to understand her motives, just as she was trying to understand his. She saw him tracing the rim of his coffee cup, his mechanic's hand surprisingly graceful. He'd found out who she was, a Santos. He knew the history, the danger inherent in their proximity, and yet he was here. "You're not what I expected," she admitted, the words escaping before her logic could stop them. He stilled. "What did you expect?" "Someone reckless, someone loud. I expected you to run when you heard my name." "Neither are you," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I expected a girl playing with fire. I didn't expect the fire to be in her." The rain streaked down the window pane beside them, blurring the world outside, cocooning them in the small, quiet space. The steam rising from their cups felt like a veil. "And for the record," he added, "I've never run from anything." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He was running from something. So was she. They were just running in different directions. He raced toward physical danger to outrun emotional pain, while she retreated into the safety of the law to escape the chaos of her bloodline. Eva felt a reluctant fascination bloom in her chest, a dangerous curiosity that her well-honed survival instincts screamed at her to ignore. Luca Rivera was a complication she couldn't afford. He was a living, breathing reminder of the world her mother had chosen, a world that had ended in prison sentences and a shattered childhood. But he was also something else. He was a man who looked at her not as the daughter of a criminal, but as a fire. And for the first time Eva felt the warmth. "One drive." The words came from Eva's mouth before she could second-guess them. They were standing outside the cafe a week later, the city air thick with the promise of an evening storm. "Just one," she clarified, her gaze firm. "No racing, no breaking the law, just driving." Luca's expression softened, the hard edges of his usual vigilance smoothing away. He nodded slowly. "Just joy." He didn't take her to the neon-slicked streets of the downtown grid. Instead, he drove the Mustang out of the city, the engine a steady, comforting purr as they climbed into the canyon roads. The setting sun bled across the sky in hues of orange and violet, painting the landscape in strokes of impossible beauty. With the windows down, the wind whipped through Eva's hair, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. It felt like shedding a skin, leaving the concrete and the expectations of the city behind. They didn't talk much at first. There was only the hum of the engine, the whisper of the wind, and the shared space inside the vintage car. He drove with an effortless grace, his hands light on the wheel, a stark contrast to the reckless abandon she'd seen in the videos. This wasn't a race. It was a meditation. He pulled over at a scenic overlook, the entire city glittering below them like a carpet of fallen stars. He cut the engine, and the silence that rushed in was different from the hollow quiet of the garage. This was a peaceful silence, vast and alive. He turned to her, his profile outlined by the dying light. "My brother died in a car crash," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its usual defences. He wasn't racing. He was on his way home from his community college class. A drunk driver ran a red light. Eva's heart clenched. She said nothing, knowing this was a story that needed silence to be told. "I was 16. He was everything I wasn't. Steady, responsible, the good son. After he was gone, everyone looked at me like I was the one who was supposed to have died. The reckless one, the one who took too many risks." He stared out at the sprawling lights below. "So, I started racing. It was the one place where I could be in complete control, every turn, every shift. It was my decision. In the car I felt alive. More than that, I felt like I could outrun the feeling that I destroy everything I touch. The confession hung between them, raw and profoundly vulnerable. Eva felt her own walls crumble, not just crack. She saw him then, not as a daredevil, but as a man trying to heal a wound so deep it had reshaped his entire world. Her own story rose to the surface, a truth she rarely shared. "When I was 12, she began, her voice trembling slightly, "my mother was sentenced to 7 years in prison. She was an accessory. She fell in love with a man, one of my father's associates, who was charming and dangerous and promised her the world. She chose him over her own family, over me. She chose a dangerous love, and it cost her everything." Eva wrapped her arms around herself. "I promised myself I would never be that stupid. I would never love someone who lived dangerously. I would build a life so safe, so stable that no one could ever take it away from me." "What if danger isn't who I am?" Luca asked softly, turning to face her fully. "Just what I do." The question was a key turning a lock deep inside her. He wasn't asking her to condone his choices. He was asking her to see the man behind them. The city lights blurred as her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing her cheek, a touch so tender it undid her. He leaned in, his gaze fixed on her lips. The air grew thick, electric with a year's worth of unspoken longing. She could taste the salt of her unshed tears, smell the leather of his jacket, feel the heat radiating from his skin. It was happening. A choice, a risk, a collision. Her phone buzzed violently in her purse, a jarring intrusion from the world below. The screen lit up with a name, Marcus Thorne, her ex-boyfriend, the prosecutor. The moment shattered. Eva pulled back, the spell broken. The phone was a cold, hard reminder of the life she had so carefully built, the promises she had made to herself. Luca retreated, his hand falling away, a mask of neutrality sliding back over his features. But she had seen him, and he had seen her. They drove back to the city in a new kind of silence, one charged with the weight of what had almost happened. They were falling, both of them, without a safety net, and every rational instinct they possessed was screaming at them to pull back. But for the first time, Eva was beginning to wonder if the fall was the only thing that could truly save them. The coffee Marcus Thorne placed on the table was a peace offering, but it felt like a trap. His prosecutor's ambition gleamed in his eyes, as polished and predatory as his expensive shoes. They sat in his sterile office, a place Eva had once seen as the pinnacle of her aspirations. Now it felt like a cage. "I know you've been looking into the street racing scene," Marcus began, his tone smooth as silk. "Impressive initiative. I have a proposition. Give my office some concrete information, names, locations, anything that leads to arrests, and I'll personally guarantee you a coveted spot in the DA's office upon graduation. A direct path, Eva. No interviews, no competition." It was everything she had ever wanted. Security, prestige, the ultimate validation of her choice to live a life governed by law and order. A life as far away from her mother's mistakes as possible. He was offering her the perfect escape hatch from the terrifying freefall she was in with Luca. All she had to do was betray him. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of Luca's confession in the canyon, the raw vulnerability in his eyes. She thought of his hands on the steering wheel, the way he made a dangerous machine feel like a part of himself. The thought of using that, of turning his world into a bargaining chip for her career, made her feel sick. But the old Eva, the one who had survived on fear and caution, whispered that this was the smart move, the safe move. That night, the lure of the race was a siren's call she couldn't resist. She told herself she was going to say goodbye, to see it one last time before cutting it out of her life. She stood in the shadows of a warehouse district, the roar of engines a familiar, painful symphony. She held her phone, her thumb hovering over the audio recorder icon. She wouldn't use it for Marcus. She didn't know what she was doing. She was torn between two futures. And then Luca saw her. He was walking toward her, a rare, soft smile on his face, a smile meant only for her. Then his eyes dropped to her hand, to the phone angled toward the staging area, the screen glowing with the telltale red of a recording app she'd opened out of nervous habit. His smile vanished. It was as if a light had been extinguished, leaving behind something cold and brittle. The warmth she had come to cherish was replaced by a look of utter betrayal. "I knew it," he said, his voice flat and dead. He didn't yell. The quiet was so much worse. He stopped a few feet away, creating a chasm between them. Racers and their crews milled around, but they were in their own desolate spotlight. The law student, researching. "I was a fool." "Luca, no," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "It's not what you think." "Isn't it?" he challenged, his voice rising now, drawing attention. "Tell me, Eva, was our drive part of your research too? Getting the subject to open up? Were you recording then?" Each word was a physical blow. "I thought I knew you," he whispered, the heartbreak in his voice more devastating than any shout. Tears streamed down her face, hot and furious. "You do!" she cried, her voice raw with a pain that ripped through the crowd's murmurs. "You know the real me better than anyone, and that's what terrifies me. This," she gestured wildly at the scene, at him, at herself. "This isn't safe, it isn't logical, and I hate that I want it anyway." Her choice crystallized in that agonizing moment. It wasn't about a career or security anymore. It was about trust. It was about him. With a choked sob, she looked him dead in the eye. Her thumb swiped across the screen, a pop-up appearing. "Delete this recording?" She pressed delete. Then she opened her contacts, found Marcus, and held the phone up so Luca could see. She blocked the number, burning the most important professional bridge she had ever built. She had chosen him. Her actions screamed it. Luca saw it. He saw the sacrifice, his face etched with fury and betrayal, flickered with confusion, then with dawning, agonizing regret. He saw that his cynicism, the armor he wore to protect his wounded heart, had just cost them everything. He had accused her of the one thing she was fighting so desperately not to be. Before she could say another word, before she could explain the choice she had just made, the wail of distant sirens cut through the night. The crowd scattered in a panic. Luca's eyes held hers for one last desperate second before his instincts took over. He turned, sprinted to his Mustang, and the sound of his car door slamming shut was like a gunshot to her heart. He sped away, leaving her standing alone in the chaos, the flashing lights growing closer, the proof of her choice a useless deleted file on a dead screen. The garage was just as she remembered it, a concrete mausoleum smelling of ghosts and gasoline. But this time Eva wasn't there as a researcher or a trespasser. She was there to make a final plea. The sun had not yet risen, and the city was cloaked in the deep pre-dawn blue. She walked to the spot where Luca's Mustang was always parked, its familiar silhouette a dark promise in the gloom. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It wasn't a legal document, filled with cold clauses and formal language. It was a letter, written on a page torn from her personal journal, the ink slightly smeared from a single teardrop. In it, she had written everything. About Marcus's offer, about her fear, about the moment she realized that a safe life meant nothing if it was an empty one. She wrote that betraying him would have been a betrayal of the only part of herself that had ever felt truly alive. She tucked the letter under the Mustang's windshield wiper, a fragile white flag against the dark glass. It was a desperate analog gesture in a digital world. A message from her heart, not her head. She had no idea if he would even see it, or if he would simply tear it up, another piece of wreckage in the crash they had become. Her part was done. She turned and walked toward the rooftop access stairs, needing to see the sunrise. Luca found the letter an hour later. He'd spent the night driving, the engine screaming what he couldn't say, trying to outrun the image of her face, the sound of her voice choosing him. He'd returned to the garage, his only sanctuary, feeling hollowed out. Then he saw it. He read the letter once, then twice, his hand shaking. Her words dismantled his anger, piece by piece, stripping it away until only the raw, aching truth remained. You know the real me better than anyone. That's what terrifies me. She wasn't afraid of his world. She was afraid of her own heart. He had accused her of being a spy when she was really a soldier fighting a war within herself, and she had chosen him. Over everything safe and sensible, she had chosen him. He took the stairs to the rooftop 2 at a time, and there she was. She stood at the edge, not dangerously, but with a quiet stillness, watching the first sliver of gold slice across the horizon. She heard his footsteps and turned. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was mingled with a fragile, fierce hope. "I'm still afraid," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the waking city's hum. He closed the distance between them, stopping just before her. "Good," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "That means this matters." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his touch a question and a promise. "Let's be afraid together." Eva leaned into his touch, a sob of relief catching in her throat. It wasn't a promise to change each other. He would always feel the pull of the race, and she would always carry the weight of her past. This was a different kind of promise, a resolution to choose love, not in the absence of fear, but in spite of it. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the frantic, interrupted moment in the car. This was a kiss of homecoming. It was slow and deep, a final, beautiful collision of 2 souls who had been racing away from themselves, only to find their finish line in each other. When they finally broke apart, the sun was bathing the city in a warm golden light. Eva looked from Luca's face to the Mustang parked just below the edge of the roof. "Teach me," she said. He looked confused. "Teach you what?" "How to drive it," she said, a small, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "Stick shift. I want to learn." He understood immediately. It wasn't about the car, it was about trust, about embracing a piece of his world, not with recklessness, but with intention. It was about learning to handle controlled danger, together. A slow smile spread across Luca's face, reaching his eyes and erasing the last of the shadows. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys to the Mustang. He didn't hand them to her. He dropped them gently into her open palm. The cool weight of the metal felt like an anchor. "Some risks are worth taking," he said softly, his fingers lacing with hers, "especially the ones that lead us home." The girl in the glitter. The desert air at Coachella in 2011 was a thick, sticky blanket woven from sweat, cheap beer, and the cloying sweetness of vape smoke. For Ethan, it was the sound that was most oppressive. The bass didn't just vibrate in his ears, it thrummed through his ribcage, a relentless, synthetic heartbeat mocking the sluggish, heavy rhythm of his own. He felt like a ghost haunting his own body, invisible among the 50,000 shimmering, writhing souls who had come to the desert to feel alive. He had come here to die. The weight in his pocket was small but dense, a physical anchor for the decision he'd made weeks ago. A bottle of pills, carefully saved, meticulously researched. It felt like the only solid thing in a world that had become a blur of grief and colourless days since his brother's accident. The plan was simple, poetic in a way he knew was pathetic. He would wait for the final headliner to play their last encore, let the final chord fade into the vast, star-dusted emptiness of the Indio night, and then he would find a quiet corner of the sprawling polo fields and swallow the handful of oblivion. He would become one with the trampled grass and discarded plastic cups, just another piece of festival refuse. Golden hour was bleeding into a bruise of purple and indigo at the horizon. The neon lights of the art installations began to pulse with an artificial life, casting long dancing shadows that made the crowd look like a forest of phantoms. Ethan leaned against a metal barrier, the cool steel a stark contrast to his feverish skin. He closed his eyes, trying to dissociate, to float away from the crushing loneliness he felt in this sea of humanity. The metallic taste of fear, or maybe just resignation, coated his tongue. And then, silence. It wasn't a true silence, not with the main stage thundering a few hundred yards away, but a pocket of stillness opened directly in front of him. The world seemed to fall away, the cacophony muted as if someone had thrown a switch. He opened his eyes. A girl stood before him. She was a kaleidoscope of the festival itself, a living, breathing art installation. Her hair was a wild mane of electric blue, and her face was a canvas of starlight. Swirls of silver and gold glitter coated her temples and cheekbones, catching the strobing lights and fracturing them into 1,000 tiny rainbows. She wore a fringed vest and cut-off shorts, her skin tanned and radiating a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert heat. But it was her hands that he would remember most. They were covered in the same cosmic dust, and as she raised them, they seemed to trail stardust through the thick air. She cupped his face, her touch impossibly gentle, a shocking point of connection in his profound isolation. Her thumbs stroked his cheeks, and for the first time in months he felt seen, truly seen. Her eyes, a deep liquid brown, held his. They were kind, so impossibly kind. "You are a beautiful soul," she said, her voice a low melodic hum that cut through the noise like a cello string. It wasn't loud, but it was the only thing he could hear. "The world is better because you're in it." Ethan's breath hitched. A sob threatened to claw its way up his throat, but he choked it down. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. He could only stare into the universe of her eyes. This couldn't be real. She had to be an illusion, a hallucination brought on by dehydration and despair. She smiled, a small knowing curve of her lips. Then she leaned forward, and her lips, soft and tasting faintly of cherry lip balm, pressed against his forehead. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of benediction, a blessing. "Promise me you'll see tomorrow's sunrise," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. And just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. She didn't walk away so much as dissolve back into the river of people, a flash of blue hair and shimmering light, swallowed by the pulsating crowd. He was left standing there, the ghost at the feast, with the ghost of her touch still tingling on his skin. He raised his own hands to his face, his fingers trembling. They came away sparkling. The cool glitter she had worn had transferred to his cheeks, his temples, his hands. It clung to him like a promise. He looked down at his palms, no longer empty but dusted with what looked like crushed stars. The final band took the stage, their opening chords ripping through the night. The crowd roared, a single massive organism breathing in the sound. But Ethan was no longer part of it. He was separate, cocooned in the memory of a stranger's touch. The weight in his pockets suddenly felt obscene, a profane violation of the sacred moment he had just been given. He turned and walked against the current of people surging towards the stage. He found a row of overflowing trash cans near the food vendors, the air thick with the smell of fried dough and regret. Without a second thought, without allowing himself to hesitate, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the small plastic bottle, and dropped it into the abyss of garbage. It made a dull, insignificant clatter as it landed. He walked away, his steps feeling lighter than they had in a year. Under the indifferent gaze of the moon, he held up his hands. The glitter was still there, sparkling in the darkness like stardust, like hope. The scent of aging paper and freshly brewed coffee was the first thing that always grounded Ethan. It was the smell of safety, of stories, of survival. A decade had passed since that night in the desert, and the cosy interior of Powell's Books in Portland was a universe away from the chaotic energy of Coachella. The rain, a signature Portland drizzle, misted the large windows, blurring the street lights into soft, impressionistic daubs of colour. Inside it was warm, intimate. He stood at the podium, the final pages of his book trembling slightly in his hand. The book tour for the Glitter Girl had been a surreal experience. He had poured the last 10 years of his life into its pages, the raw, unvarnished story of his descent into despair, and the single miraculous encounter that had pulled him back from the edge. It was a memoir, but it felt more like a map of his own heart. And so, I live a life built on a promise made to a stranger, he read, his voice catching on the familiar words. The small, attentive audience listened with a hushed reverence that still humbled him. I never saw her again. I don't know her name or the colour of her hair when it isn't electric blue, but I see her in every sunrise I have the privilege to witness. I feel her in every moment of unexpected kindness. She was my shooting star, a brilliant, brief, burning light that seared herself into my memory. And this book, this life, is my thank you. He paused, clearing his throat before reading the final crucial line. This is for the girl in the glitter. I hope wherever you are, you're happy. I hope you're still seeing the sunrise. A wave of gentle, heartfelt applause filled the space. Ethan smiled, a genuine, grateful expression that reached his eyes. He answered questions, signed copies of his book with a hand that no longer shook, and shared anecdotes that were now polished from repetition. He spoke about his work as a suicide prevention counsellor, a career he had chosen as a way to honour the grace he'd been shown. The crowd began to disperse, drifting back out into the soft, rainy night, their signed books tucked under their arms. Ethan was packing his bag when he heard the hesitant footsteps. He looked up to see a woman standing a few feet away, clutching a copy of The Glitter Girl to her chest like a shield. She was nothing like the phantasmagoric girl of his memory. Her hair was a sensible shoulder-length brown. She wore a charcoal grey blazer over a simple white blouse, tailored slacks, and practical low-heeled shoes. Her face was pale, almost bare of makeup, and her expression was one of profound, gut-wrenching nervousness. She looked like an accountant, or perhaps a librarian. She did not look like someone who would cover herself in glitter and kiss a stranger at a music festival. "I'm sorry to bother you," she began, her voice a careful whisper, a stark contrast to the boisterous energy of the girl he remembered. "I know this is going to sound insane." She took a deep, shaky breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the book. "But I think I might be her, the Glitter Girl." Ethan felt the world tilt on its axis. The air in the bookstore suddenly felt thin, charged. He had dreamed of this moment for 10 years, played out 1,000 different scenarios in his mind. In his fantasies, she was always the same, a whirlwind of colour and light recognizing him instantly. But this woman, this quiet, buttoned-up, anxious woman, he studied her, searching for a trace, a flicker of the girl who had saved his life. He saw nothing of her in the muted colours she wore, in the controlled posture she held. The rain outside seemed to intensify, drumming a restless rhythm against the glass. "I was different to then," she said, as if reading his thoughts. Her eyes, he noticed now, were a familiar shade of deep liquid brown. "I was what I couldn't sustain being." She offered a small, self-deprecating laugh that sounded more like a sigh. "Life happens. I grew up. Or maybe I just folded inward." Ethan said nothing. He simply looked at her, truly looked. He looked past the conservative blazer and the nervous tremor in her voice. He looked into her eyes, and that's when he saw it. It wasn't a flash of recognition of him, but a flicker of something else, something deeper, a familiar light. It was the same depth, the same well of fierce, gentle love he had seen in the desert. It was older now, shaded with a sadness or a weariness he couldn't name, but it was unmistakably there. The ghost of the girl in the glitter, looking out from behind a stranger's eyes. The 24-hour diner was an island of harsh fluorescent light in the dark, rain-slicked Portland night. The air smelled of stale coffee and bacon grease, a world away from the literary warmth of the bookstore. They sat in a cracked red vinyl booth, a chipped ceramic mug of coffee between them. The woman, Maya, stirred her own cup with a methodical slowness, her gaze fixed on the swirling vortex of cream and coffee. "I became a lawyer," she said, her voice barely rising above the low hum of the refrigerators. "Corporate litigation. It's structured, predictable." She finally looked up, a wry, tired smile on her lips. "The polar opposite of who I was at 21. Over the next hour, under the unforgiving diner lights, the story of her transformation unspooled. The wild child with electric blue hair had been a performance, a desperate attempt to outrun a grief of her own. Her mother had passed away a year before that festival, and Maya had thrown herself into a whirlwind of parties, music and reckless abandon, trying to feel anything other than the hollow ache in her chest. She was the life of every party, the girl who danced until dawn, the free spirit everyone adored. But it was a role she was playing, and the costume was heavy. "I was running on fumes," she confessed, her fingers tracing nervous, invisible patterns on the Formica tabletop. "That night at Coachella, I was lost. I'd lost my friends, my phone was dead, and I was coming down from something I probably shouldn't have taken. I was just as lost as you were, Ethan, just in a different way." The pressure to be that vibrant, fearless person became unsustainable. A few years later, a series of crippling panic attacks had brought her carefully constructed world crashing down. The anxiety was a cruel tax on her wildness. So she had buried that girl. She'd cut her hair, dyed it a sensible brown, traded her festival wristbands for a briefcase, and built a new life. One defined by control, by rules, by colour-coded calendars and quiet, predictable evenings. She had traded her glitter for armour. Ethan listened, his own coffee growing cold. He saw the immense courage in her confession, a vulnerability that was perhaps even braver than the impulsive kindness she'd shown him a decade ago. He felt a profound sense of connection to this version of her, this careful, wounded woman who had once been his saviour. It was his turn. He told her everything, not just the story from the book, but the gritty, painful details. The suffocating weight of his brother's death, the way the world had lost its colour, the cold, clinical finality of his plan. He explained how her 5 seconds of grace had become the cornerstone of his entire existence. "You didn't just make me see the sunrise, Maya," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was 10 years in the making. "You gave me a reason to keep watching them. I went back to school, I became a counsellor. I've spent the last 7 years sitting with people in their darkest moments, trying to be for them what you were for me, a flicker of light, a hand reaching out in the dark." A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, embarrassed. "But I'm not that person anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking. The fear in her eyes was palpable. "I'm not a flicker of light. I am spreadsheets and billable hours. I have panic attacks if my grocery delivery is late. What if I can't be what that moment meant to you? What if I'm just a disappointment?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and fragile. It was the heart of it all, the fear that the reality could never live up to the myth that had sustained him. Ethan felt a surge of protectiveness, a need to comfort the woman who had once unknowingly done the same for him. He looked at her, truly saw her, the tension in her shoulders, the carefully controlled expression that couldn't quite mask the vulnerability in her eyes. He realised he wasn't looking for proof of the girl from the festival anymore. He was connecting with the woman who had survived her. He reached across the table, his hand gently covering hers. Her fingers were tense beneath his touch. "Girl at the festival wasn't magic, Maya," he said, his voice soft but certain. "She was hurting and she was lost, but she was still brave enough to be kind. That's the part that saved me. The kindness." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "That's the person sitting right in front of me now. I can see her so clearly." She looked up from their hands, her gaze meeting his. The fear in her eyes didn't vanish, but it softened, making way for a fragile, dawning sense of being truly seen. For the first time all night, a genuine, unforced tear of relief slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe this one away. In the harsh fluorescent light of the diner, she simply turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. The rain had returned with a vengeance, lashing against the windows of Maya's apartment in relentless, angry sheets. The apartment itself was a reflection of the woman she had become, minimalist, controlled, safe. The walls were a soft, non-committal grey. The furniture was modern and angular. There were no photographs, no clutter, no chaos. It was a fortress built against the unpredictability of life, and right now the walls were closing in. The weight of it all, the book, Ethan's story, the impossible burden of being someone's salvation, had finally broken through her carefully constructed defences. She was pacing the length of her living room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if to hold her splintering pieces together. Her breathing was shallow, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. A classic panic attack, a monster she hadn't wrestled with in years. "I can't do this," she gasped, turning to Ethan, her face pale with terror. He had followed her home from the diner, a silent, steady presence she hadn't known she needed, till this very moment. "I'm a fraud, Ethan. I'm not your glitter girl. I'm a lie." "Maya, breathe," he said, his voice calm and even, the counsellor in him taking over. He didn't move towards her, giving her space. "You're not a lie. You're here. You're real." "No!" Her voice rose, sharp with hysteria. "You don't understand." The confession that had been hovering at the edge of her thoughts all night finally spilled out, raw and painful. "The truth is, I barely remember that night. I barely remember you." The words struck Ethan with the force of a physical blow. The rain against the glass seemed to roar in his ears. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a chilling echo of the despair he'd felt that night at the festival. "I was so high," she continued, her voice breaking, the words tumbling out in a torrent of self-loathing. "I was lost and scared and running from my own ghosts. That whole period of my life is a blur of strobe lights and bad decisions. I remember the glitter, I remember the feeling of wanting to connect with someone, anyone. But the words, kissing your forehead, making you promise, Ethan, don't have a clear memory of it. It was probably just some drug-fueled, impulsive thing I did without a second thought." His entire transformation, his life's work, the very foundation of his recovery, was it all built on an illusion? Had he woven a grand, life-saving narrative around a moment that was nothing more than a chemical flicker in a stranger's brain? The thought was a black hole, threatening to swallow the last decade of his life whole. The girl who had saved him wasn't a mystical angel. She was just a high-party girl who didn't even remember her act of grace. The stability he had so carefully built felt like it was fracturing beneath his feet. He sank onto her minimalist sofa, the clean lines offering no comfort. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by Maya's ragged sobs and the drumming of the rain. She watched him, her own pain momentarily eclipsed by the devastation she saw on his face. She had saved him once by accident, and now she was destroying him with the truth. A desperate need to find something, anything, to prove that the moment was real for both of them seized her. "Wait," she whispered, a sudden thought cutting through her panic. She scrambled to a sleek, built-in bookshelf and pulled a large, plain storage box from the bottom shelf. Kneeling on the floor, she blew a layer of dust from its lid and opened it. Inside were the relics of a life she had locked away, old ticket stubs, faded photographs, and a stack of leather-bound journals. Her hands shook as she thumbed through them, searching for the right year. "I used to write everything down," she mumbled, more to herself than to him. It was the only way I could make sense of the chaos. She found it. A journal with a peeling peace sign sticker on the cover. 2011. She flipped through the messy looping script, her heart pounding. Her entries were a chaotic mix of song lyrics, frantic thoughts, and raw, unfiltered emotion. And then she stopped. Her finger rested on a page dated 2 days after the festival. Her breath caught. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes wide with a fragile, dawning hope. "Listen," she said, her voice trembling as she began to read. "Indio. So much noise, so many people trying so hard to be happy. It all feels so fake. But I saw this boy tonight, standing by himself near the gates. He wasn't dancing. He wasn't even watching the bands. He was just disappearing. He had the saddest eyes I have ever seen, like he was already a ghost. I felt this insane urge to go over there. Not to talk to him, but to just, I don't know, tell him he was still made of stardust. I wanted to save him. I wanted to tell him that whatever was breaking him, he was still whole." Tears were streaming down her face now, but they were not tears of panic. They were tears of validation, of memory, of truth. She looked at Ethan, her gaze clear and certain. "I may not remember saying the words, Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick but strong. The musty smell of the old journal filled the air, a scent of unearthed truth. "But I meant it. God, I meant every word." They had talked all night. The storm outside had broken, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air cool and sharp with the smell of wet pavement and damp earth. As the first hint of grey began to soften the edges of the black sky, Maya's apartment, once a fortress of sterile control, felt like a sanctuary. The open journal lay on the coffee table between them, a testament to the truth they had unearthed. "He made me promise to see the sunrise," Maya said softly, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips as she looked from the journal to Ethan. Ethan corrected gently. "She made me promise." It was his idea to go to the roof, a way to honour the original request, to close a circle that had been left open for a decade. They climbed the final flight of stairs and pushed open the heavy metal door, stepping out into the cool pre-dawn air. The city of Portland was just beginning to stir below them, a tapestry of dark rooftops and sleeping streets. A few lone cars moved like fireflies in the distance. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the eastern horizon shift from charcoal to violet to a pale, hopeful rose. The profound realization settled over both of them, not as a crisis this time, but as a quiet, liberating truth. He was not the broken boy on the verge of disappearing. She was not the wild, glitter-dusted girl running from her own pain. They had been saved, both of them, not just by each other, but by the passage of time and the hard, painful work of healing. And that was okay. It was more than okay. It was real. "I was so afraid," Maya confessed, her voice a soft cloud in the chilly air, "that you had fallen in love with a memory, a girl who doesn't exist anymore." "I think I did," Ethan admitted, his honesty stark and beautiful in the growing light. "For a long time that memory was the only thing that kept me alive, but sitting with you, the real you in that diner, and seeing you last night, fighting your own battles. Maya, the girl in the glitter saved my life. But the woman standing next to me now, she's the one I want to build a new life with." A wave of emotion washed over her, so pure and warm it brought fresh tears to her eyes. in a gesture that felt both spontaneous and deeply significant. She shrugged off the sensible cardigan she wore. Underneath she had on a simple tank top, and there, on her shoulder, was a small shimmering tattoo of a single star, traced in delicate, glittering ink, hidden remnant of the girl she thought she'd buried. Ethan reached out and gently traced its outline with his finger. It was a bridge between her past and her present, a quiet declaration that growth didn't mean erasing who you were, but integrating it. "You saved me once," she said, her voice full of a strength he hadn't heard before, a quiet echo of the girl at the festival. "By being exactly who you are, broken and beautiful, let me love you now, by being exactly who I am." As the top edge of the sun finally breached the horizon, spilling molten gold across the skyline, Maya reached into the pocket of her slacks. She pulled out a tiny corked glass vial. Ethan watched, mesmerized, as she uncorked it and tipped a small amount of its contents into her palm. Glitter, faded and less brilliant than he remembered, but unmistakably the same cosmic dust. "I kept some," she explained with a watery laugh. "A souvenir. Or maybe just a reminder." With a slow, deliberate tenderness, she dipped a finger into the stardust. She reached up and dotted a small shimmering patch onto her own cheekbone. Then she turned to him. Her hand was steady as she gently pressed a sprinkle of the glitter onto his cheek, in the very same spot she might have touched all those years ago. The sun crested the horizon, flooding the rooftop with brilliant, hopeful light. The warmth of her hand was in his, their fingers intertwined. The city was waking up below them, the sounds of a new day beginning to rise. They weren't preserving a perfect, fleeting moment from the past. They were creating a new one, a sunrise of their very own, built not on a memory but on a second chance. And in the golden light the glitter on their cheeks sparkled, a promise of all the sunrises yet to come.